Fallout 4's settlement building mechanic can be a great way to break the monotony of doing Radiant quests for the major factions and feeling like you're actually making your mark on the Commonwealth, a legacy that will last for years to come. Until Todd just decides to nuke it off camera anyway. The problem that the tutorial explaining how the settlement workshop functions is hot garbage, and learning how to build amazing settlements is usually left to you, the player, to figure out on your own. Thankfully, the internet is filled with opinionated YouTubers who are willing to share the tips and tricks they've learned through the unreasonably high number of hours they've sunk into Fallout 4. So if you're ready to learn, stock up on concrete and scrap metal, and make sure your recruitment beacon is broadcasting, because I'm Gray, you're watching Gray Gaming, and today I'm going to share every tip and trick for building settlements I've learned in my quest to rebuild the Commonwealth. Now, many of these tips and tricks have appeared in some of my earlier videos, especially those early top 5 lists with low-res game footage and poor audio quality. So if you've been around the Gray Gaming ecosystem for a while, you're probably familiar with many of these, but I swear there will be some new ones included. Probably. These tips don't require any mods, glitches, or exploits, though one of them can and often is incorrectly called an exploit. I'll try to organize these into sections for general building tips and tricks, settler hacks, things to know about settlement happiness scores, dealing with resource collection and management, those sorts of things. So let's get into it. So one of the first things a lot of people learn when they enter workshop mode is that the buildable area of a new settlement is surrounded by a translucent-y, fluorescent-y barrier thingy. It appears green from the inside and red from the outside, and this marks the horizontal boundaries of your settlement. But what can get pretty annoying is that this barrier is actually 3-dimensional, and that there's actually a maximum depth that you're allowed to sink certain items below the ground and a certain height that you're allowed to build above it. These barriers, unfortunately, are not marked, so we're often left guessing how tall we're actually allowed to build before we reach the upper limit. It's a good idea as you're planning out your settlement's layout, aesthetic, theme, etc. to do a bit of scouting beforehand, figuring out the best way to work around the terrain, where the largest patches of unobstructed build area is, and figuring out just how large of a structure you're allowed to build. Snapping a few sets of stairs end to end until they aren't allowed to be placed anymore is a good way to determine the settlement's ceiling before you discover halfway through building a giant structure that half of it just won't fit. The build ceiling varies from site to site, from the unreasonably low, such as found at Hangman's Alley, only 4 or 5 floors from ground level, to the ridiculously towering 20 stories you can climb to at Abernathy Farm. The object snapping feature of the workshop can be a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it makes it a simple matter to build walls in a perfectly straight line that doesn't look like a piece of wavy bacon. Dang it, now I'm hungry. Anyway, once you've reached a point where you want said wall to turn a corner, however, the snapping feature becomes a total pain in the tuchus, because the walls tend to only want to snap in a continuous line. The solution to this issue is so simple it doesn't often occur to people because it couldn't possibly be that easy. Could it?
All of this just works. It's not, I'm not kidding.
Anyway, an easy way to get around this is to construct the floors of your buildings and structures first, as walls have a snapping preference. They tend to want to snap to other walls first, but floors and ceilings second. Meaning once you've reached the corner of your floor pad, the walls will just try to continue the line, but if you rotate your view just a little bit, it will next try to snap around the corner to the flooring instead, giving you a perfect 90-degree bend every single time. This trick also works if you're trying to wall off a settlement. Simply placing a temporary floor pad or ceiling at the point you want the fence to turn will allow you to place a corner, and then scrapping or storing the floor for later means that you can completely circumnavigate a settlement with a continuous barrier without a single break or gap in the line, other than gates and doors of your choosing. Now, if you're about to leave a nasty comment about the futility of wall builds at settlements, please hold off for a couple minutes, because later in this section I do have some info that might calm your nerves better than a bottle of Bobrov's Best. But first, since I was already talking about floors, here's a tip for that. So you're probably having the same problem a lot of first-time builders in the Commonwealth are having. You select a site for a shack, donut shop, or some other structure, you lay down the floor, and it's got piles of garbage, dirt, and plants clipping through, making it just as much of an eyesore as all of the other rotting shacks in the wasteland. It's a brand new structure. Why are bushes already growing through the floor? The solution to this is actually quite simple. You see, there are several cuboid foundation floor pieces, sometimes made of cinder blocks, sometimes solid concrete, and sometimes just wooden posts sunk into the dirt. These are designed in a way that lets you place most of it under the ground, allowing you to raise or lower the entire floor as needed. This lets you place the base of your structures just high enough from the ground that you no longer have anything clipping through your nice new flooring, and makes the interiors of your new structures look much more like they haven't been abandoned and neglected for years, sorta like everything else in the Commonwealth. You can also build stilted structures or buildings that utilize an unfinished ground floor so that the common areas are clean and pristine, and the areas that aren't so clean can be used for utilities, storage, or something else you want mostly out of sight and out of mind. It seems like it happens to us all the time. We start a settlement, we turn on the radio recruitment beacon while we work, and by the time we've built all we possibly can, the settlement's population has gotten away from us and now is too large for our new city to support. Now we're forced to compromise on our designs, placing additional food crops, water pumps, and beds in places that we never intended them to be because there's simply no room left in the areas that we designated for those use cases. There is actually another option, but we'll get to that later. A simple way to avoid this sticky situation is to simply wait until after our settlement is built before we turn on that radio recruitment beacon. This lets you determine the absolute maximum population your new settlement can adequately support before you've exceeded it, and makes for less stress moving forward. And while we're on the topic of populating our settlements, so you've sifted through every object menu in the workshop. You know everything that can be built at your new site, so the only thing left is to build, until you realize that many of the cool things you had hoped to include are trapped behind perks that have higher level requirements, or were just things that you hadn't planned on incorporating into your character build. That nifty fusion reactor instead has to be replaced with an array of noisy, stinky, smog-producing gas generators. Costly and less productive stores have to be used until you can earn the necessary perks to build those grand level 3 stores. And those turrets that could tear a Deathclaw to shreds have to be replaced with lower grade turrets that will struggle to do more than annoy even the weakest raiders. Compromising on your vision is troublesome and disappointing for multiple reasons, not the least of which being the added hassle of having to scrap or store all of the lower grade stuff you'll probably never have a use for ever again. But you also won't get the same amount of materials by scrapping a device as it costs to build it in the first place, so you're also going to be dealing with a net loss of building materials by constructing interim solutions. So the easiest thing to do, which sadly is also the most frustrating, is just making the decision not to populate that dream settlement until you've reached the necessary level to grab all those prerequisite perks and build it right the first time. I'll have a bit more on the pros and cons of scrapping versus storing objects in the section on resource management, but for now let's keep moving. You don't know what you don't know. The hardest part of learning is just figuring out the right questions to ask, and there are a ton of rules to follow when building settlements, like you can't snap concrete to wood, or Vault-Tec to sheet metal, or Vault-Tec to Vault-Tec sometimes. Adam, I hate that build set. But there are also tons of exceptions to these rules, such as just about any walls being able to snap to most flooring styles, or being able to snap Vault-Tec handrails to some types of wood or concrete flooring. There are so many collision issues that prevent some objects from snapping to each other that can be fixed by temporarily replacing one object type with another. Really, the only way to know for sure what's possible is to experiment for yourself. Mess around with different build sets, and if you can't get one object to snap to another, maybe see if it will snap to another similar object, or watch some random YouTuber tutorials. What? That wasn't a shameless plug. I was talking about Schooled Zone. He's great, but I do have a series called Commonwealth Contractor. It has some good techniques for beginners. Moving on. Sometimes, especially when we're just learning our way around the workshop, there comes a time when we get a settlement to just good enough status and decide to leave it as is. But as we learn new techniques, develop new styles, or just discover general ways to make our settlements better, those older builds can start to become more and more of a chore to deal with than a point of pride. Sure, they're there to remind us where we came from, but they also sort of serve as a point of shame. The thing is, they don't have to be. Just because you sank 12 hours into a mediocre settlement doesn't mean that it's too late to spend another couple making it brilliant. A great personal example that I showcased on this channel was when I went through my 9-story tall tower build that ended up having a ton of unnecessary floor space and was tanking my game's performance due to the number of objects that had to be rendered, and I completely redesigned the entire thing floor by floor. I shrank, consolidated, or completely relocated several areas, making more efficient use of the lower levels and allowing me to remove an entire 2 floors from that structure, drastically improving my system's performance in the process by removing the number of objects that needed to be rendered. It's never too late to fix those settlements that are falling just shy of excellence. The settlement size meter is the bane of many a noob's existence. YouTube is filled with these gorgeous, massive settlements, but even the ones that say they're mod-free, exploit-free, glitch-free, cage-free, free-range, certified organic, and antibiotic-free settlement builds all seem to be orders of magnitude larger than anything you're able to construct before that build meter maxes out and you're no longer allowed to build anymore at a given site. Now, this did serve a valid purpose when the game came out. This was a necessary limitation that prevents the game from crashing. As often anyway, it is a Bethesda game after all. Crash is gonna crash. But here in 2024, or whatever year you're watching this, the limit is more of a guideline than a rule. And you can usually get away with exceeding the build limit by a pretty large margin before you start to run into problems. Newer consoles, several generations of PC component improvements, and just better optimization and mod support means that modern systems can handle quite a bit more than they could in 2015. But if we don't have to completely abide by the settlement size limit anymore, exactly how do we sidestep it in the first place? It is a limit after all. Well, the way that the build meter works is that as you use the workshop to remove objects from a settlement by clearing junk or by storing objects you have a future use case for, the number of polygons that the game engine needs to render at once goes down, and thus the size meter is reduced, allowing you to construct more objects to replace them. The more polygons you remove, the more you can place back in, so removing one geometrically complex object will allow you to place several geometrically simple objects to replace it. The trick here is that there aren't really objects that belong to a given settlement. Otherwise, the game would have to potentially have over 38 different variants of a given item or object, and ain't no developer got time for that. Instead, the workshop just assumes that if an object is within the bounds of a settlement, it's okay to store or scrap that object. So you can really just dump any old item on the ground and either scrap or store it using the workshop. The workshop registers that something was removed, and it decrements the build meter accordingly. Now, some items can only be stored, some items can only be scrapped, and some you have the option to decide, but both actions will reduce the settlement size in the meter. Heavily modded weapons tend to be very geometrically complex, not to mention contain lots of rarer materials if you have the scrapper perk leveled, so dumping a bunch of weapons onto the ground and either storing or scrapping will heavily increase the number of new polygons you're able to add to a settlement, allowing you to almost infinitely expand a settlement. Now, don't go too overboard with this technique, as you can still heavily destabilize your game if you take things too far. Severe drops in frame rate, increases in the number of game crashes, even corrupted save files can be just a few of the more serious side effects caused by unrestricted settlement sizes. Keep it reasonable or suffer the consequences is all I'm gonna say about that. And just in case you're about to flood the comments with, "But you said no exploits," this is not an exploit. An exploit is taking advantage of weaknesses in design to make a system do what it was never intended to do. This trick is using the settlement meter exactly as it was designed, but in a manner that it was not intended. It's misuse, not an exploit. An analogy I like to use is, say you're messing around in your Prius one day, and you discover that if you hold down the volume up button while the left turn signal is engaged and roll the windows up, that it disables the fuel economy governor and gives you an extra 30 horsepower. That's an exploit. You're making the system do something that it was never intended to do. On the other hand, holding down the gas pedal until you exceed the speed limit is misuse. That's not an exploit. The gas pedal is doing what it was designed to do, make the car go faster, but you're using it in an unsafe manner. When I was going to school for a program where every class requires students to define exploits, BT-dub, I discovered that one of the vending machines in my building had a vulnerability in its design. If I held the dispense button for 2 seconds, then quickly released and pressed it a second time before it dispensed, I could force the machine to dispense 2 bottles of Nuka-Cola for the price of 1. That was an exploit. I gained 25 pounds that year because of excess sugar consumption. That was misuse. Double whammy. Okay, back on topic. Storing guns or other items using the workshop will just add them to the workshop inventory, so you can repeatedly pull them out of the inventory and repeat the process over and over again, but you won't gain any resources in the process. Scrapping them, on the other hand, will add some good raw resources to the workshop, especially if you've invested in the scrapper perk, but will also consume them in the process, so you'll still have to go out adventuring to whip up another batch of objects to sacrifice to the mighty build meter. So whichever of these two options you choose really depends on your needs at the time and your resource management strategy. So when I was discussing walling off your settlements, you may have been one of the many people that have done that very thing, only to discover time and time again that attackers are already inside your walls when you arrive to fight them off. The reason for this is that most settlements have one or more specific locations that attacking enemies spawn at every time a settlement comes under attack. At some locations, it's just a single spawn point right on the edge of the settlement or completely outside the buildable areas, such as in the case of the Nuka World Red Rocket, where they spawn next to an old billboard on the far north edge of the sprawling settlement site. Other sites can have multiple spawn points in absolutely horrid spots, such as at Somerville Place, where enemies spawn right next to the front porch of the unscrappable house and right on top of the fast travel marker, meaning you're instantly being set upon by attackers and a wall surrounding the settlement is almost completely pointless for defense purposes. Now, each settlement is going to be completely different, so learning exactly where the spawn points are is going to be a matter of experience, so your options are pretty limited. You either have to exercise patience and mental note-taking as you deal with multiple attacks, determining where they're standing the instant you fast travel to fight off an attack, or alternatively, there is a mod, whose name I don't know because I try and keep as close to vanilla as possible, that will mark the spawn locations before you build, so you can determine whether a wall would be appropriate for a site and how best to plan your defenses. It can be a time-consuming hassle to deal with all the attacks that plague our settlement network, but it's a relatively simple matter of liking this video if you found the suggestions helpful thus far. Viewer engagement is the primary metric I use to determine the sort of content that provides the most value to you, a random person on the internet who has the power to choose if I can afford new bedding or if I have to stick with what I'm currently using. Yeesh. Anyway, please, thank you, and now on to the settler hacks section. The ability to move settlers around between settlements is not a mechanic that is well explained at all. Most people are aware that after gaining the local leader perk level 1, you can assign settlers to a provisioner route. Provisioners travel back and forth between their home settlement and another site, guiding pack Brahmin that carry supplies back and forth. Food, water, and building materials are shared between these sites, so the more settlements you can connect into a common network, the longer you're able to build before you run out of a given resource. This also means that you can establish settlements in locations where things like water and food can't be farmed, such as the Mechanist Layer and Boston Airport, as food and water can be supplied by settlements that produce an excess supply. Just as a side note here, you cannot share stored objects from site to site, so if you store a bunch of turrets at one location, you can't automatically build them for no resource cost at another. You can only do that within a single site, unfortunately. But an ability that's never expanded on at all is the fact that you can actually permanently relocate settlers from one location to another. Did you accidentally exceed the population that a settlement can support? You can move some of those settlers to a site that has additional capacity. You have an issue with a sausage fest forming? Maybe exchange some of the dudes at one site for some women from another site. Or maybe you didn't realize that having robots in your settlement will prevent it from ever reaching 100% happiness ratings. Well, you can move your automatrons to an all-robot settlement like Grey Garden. Some locations don't allow you to build a radio recruitment beacon like the Boston Airport or the Mechanist Layer, so the only way to populate them is to send settlers from other points. So just remember, the random, unpredictable nature of recruitment beacons is only one of the ways that you can settle a site. The possibilities and utility are pretty much as varied as your imagination will allow. Fallout 4, like most games, starts out pretty dang grindy. At lower levels, you don't have access to the cooler settlement objects, which are locked behind perks, which in turn are often locked behind level restrictions. You're also probably wearing low-end gear and looting enemies who also wear low-end gear, most of which does not have a lot of trade value, and the weapons don't deal that much damage, so you need a lot of ammo to keep them fed. This makes getting into settlement building at lower levels a chore because you often struggle to get your hands on the materials to build anything other than cobbled together shacks. And if your settlements grow too quickly, you can struggle to keep your settlers fed, as it's difficult to harvest your crops fast enough to plant new ones. But something that doesn't often occur to inexperienced wasteland mayors is that the settlers arriving at their new townships don't arrive empty-handed. They often arrive with a spare change of clothes, sometimes a secondary weapon, a pile of ammo, and some sort of food item. They don't raise any objection to you clearing out any excess items that they aren't using, so maybe you have a use case for the spare clothes they're carrying, or you just want to sell it to pay for other necessities. That's fine by them. And the way that the game works is NPCs can fire indefinitely as long as they have a single round of ammunition for their weapon. So you can take all but one round of their ammo and they're just as effective at defending their settlement as they would be if they had 1,000 rounds. If they're carrying fresh vegetables, you can use those to plant food, adding variety to a settlement's community garden and scaling how quickly you can grow the food supply to match your population's demand. These are just a few of the ways that you can leverage your own settlers to more quickly scale and improve quality of life for everyone in your settlement network. But trading gear doesn't always have to be such a one-sided affair, and indeed, there are benefits to giving back to your settlers rather than always taking. Wasteland settlers can more than hold their own, in the beginning of a new playthrough anyway. But as the sole survivor gains a few levels, the attackers who hit their settlements also tend to level up with them, while the settlers never really do. They always wear low-grade armor or no armor at all, and wield basic pipe weapons or like 10mm pistols at best. They still do the best they can to help the sole survivor deal with settlement attack scenarios, but when you're fighting off super mutants and deathclaws, they're at an obvious disadvantage. But as the sole survivor levels, there may be a lot of weapons and armor that they can loot from fallen enemies that the sole survivor may not have a lot of use for, but are leaps and bounds better than what these wasters tend to arrive with. You have the option to kit out your settlers with full suits of armor, the highest grade weaponry, even standardized uniforms if it suits your fancy. You don't have to just accept the Mad Max-ish clothing and weapon choices they start out with. An entire settlement equipped with miniguns and gauze rifles and protected with ballistic weave reinforced clothing under high-grade combat armors will shred through anything that comes their way. Unfortunately, only as long as the sole survivor is there to witness it, but it makes dealing with attacks a lot less of a chore than if you're effectively having to do all the hard work yourself. If you haven't figured out by now, protecting your settlements isn't always a simple or straightforward process. Traps, automated turrets, sentry posts, even guard dogs and tamed wasteland creatures, you have tons of options for how to defend your settlements. One of these options, the sentry posts, may seem like an easy, low resource cost method of defending your settlements. Settlers assigned to guard duty will stand post and patrol between up to 3 guard posts, but once a settlement attack takes place, they leave their guard posts in order to seek out and destroy the enemy, which is the default behavior of all settlers. So there's absolutely no difference in the protection they provide as guards compared to the defense they would provide as, say, a barber or a shopkeeper. Yes, the guard posts increase the defense rating of your settlement, which serves to reduce the chances the settlement will be attacked, but they serve no purpose when deterrence fails. So unless you're needing an object whose entire purpose is just to make a settler stand in a specific spot all day, it's best to just avoid them altogether and use something like turrets or traps instead, which will also free up those settlers to perform other, more useful tasks, and it still allows them to respond to attacks just as if they were assigned to guard duty. One of the worst things about settlements, other than the fact that there's always one that needs our help, is the fact that our settlers have some gosh darn boundary issues.
It's the gosh darn truth.
During attacks, your settlers don't care how much time you spent tracking down that junk jet or how proudly you've been displaying Maxon's battle code. If it's better than what they're using, they're going to make a beeline for it as soon as the bullets start flying, making it next to impossible to figure out where Adam's judgment went. And if they climb into your power armor, good luck getting them to leave it without console commands. I once had a Minuteman patrol gank like 4 suits of power armor and then walk off into the Commonwealth with it. Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. Anyway, there are ways to protect your possessions from your own settlers' grubby hands. The easiest way is to outfit your settlers with good gear to begin with. If they're already using the best gear available, they don't necessarily care about the unique wall hangers that you've got on display. Another option is to simply store your gear in a room that is not accessible by their basic pathing behaviors. This might involve a walkway with a gap that must be jumped over, as settlers don't like platforming, or you could use a powered door connected to a power switch. Cutting the power seals the door, and settlers are apparently too dumb to figure out an on-off switch. And for power armor, it's as simple as removing the fusion core from suits when you put them into storage. This trick, however, only works if you didn't gear out any of your settlers with a Gatling laser, as they will instead use the fusion core meant to serve as their ammo supply to grab power armor instead. This is doubly stupid because once it's in the power armor, they no longer have ammo for their Gatling laser, so they're attacking unarmed as well. Still, as long as you follow these basic rules, there are plenty of options to ensure your personal collections remain just that, your personal collections. Your settlers are aching for community and self-reliance, but nobody can do it all. Thankfully, they're all willing to learn, and you can assign them to just about any task which they will perform to the best of their abilities. From farmers to facial surgeons, they try hard. But the simple fact is that some people just have expertise and life experience that makes them better suited to some tasks than most. These people can be found in every corner of the Commonwealth, sometimes in specific locations and sometimes encountered out of pure chance, or if you're a PC overlord with basic console commands that bring them to you. Most of these recruitable characters serve as well-connected traders and shopkeepers who, when assigned to Tier 3 storefronts of a specific type, have the best inventory selection, the most gold to trade with, and often even unique items that can't be acquired anywhere else. These, sometimes referred to as Tier 4 traders, can be immensely helpful for amassing large amounts of gold and building materials, as well as a great place to offload those 45 servings of mutt chops you have no intention of eating. They include Ron Staples working the bar, Doc Anderson over at the clinic, Trader Riley, Tina DeLuca, and the Vault-Tec representative, who all become Tier 4 junk vendors, allowing you to spread the love across multiple settlements, although after 9 years of gameplay I still can't figure out how to actually recruit Tina. There's also the Brotherhood Scribe as armor merchant, Smiling Larry dealing in weapons, and Anne Hargraves, who is a seamstress and professional actress by trade selling the latest fashions. You can also recruit Sheffield from Diamond City, but he doesn't really bring any additional skills with him. He's just a named NPC you can send wherever you like. The same is true of Preston's gaggle of misfits. The point is, your settlement doesn't have to be comprised entirely of unnamed NPCs, and the right people assigned to the right jobs can offer a lot of fringe benefits that can ever so slightly reduce the grind of establishing your fledgling empire. Speaking of the grind of settlement building, nothing puts a halt to your empire erecting efforts than running out of a specific resource, forcing you to go out hunting for more of it, which is why we have an entire section devoted to collecting those hard-to-come-by components. If you've done any amount of Google or YouTube foo around the best ways to leverage Fallout 4 settlements to improve your gameplay experience, you've probably heard of a water farm. Just in case you haven't heard of a water farm, it is a settlement that is set up to produce large quantities of purified water, far in excess of what is required to support a settlement's population. In addition to being a useful first aid item, purified water is also a necessary ingredient for the crafting of several chems and food items. If all else fails, it can be a valuable trade item, though mostly just for local transactions, because it does weigh an awful lot in comparison to its trade value. But water farms aren't the only useful type of farm. There is also adhesive farms as an example. Adhesive is a necessary component in almost every single weapons and armor modification, but there aren't really a whole lot of chances to acquire large amounts of it in a single place. However, vegetable starch can be crafted at a cooking station using purified water, potatoes, corn, and mute fruit. Food farms that produce large amounts of these plant ingredients in conjunction with a water farm can be invaluable for upgrading your gear quickly, and with a minimum of travel and bartering required. Brahmin ranches are also extremely helpful. Brahmin will randomly wander into settlements that are actively recruiting and stick around once they're there, and with the addition of the Wasteland Workshop DLC, live traps can even be set up to attract Brahmin to a specific settlement even if it's not actively recruiting. Brahmin might not have much of an apparent purpose for existing, but Brahmin produce bountifully burly bulks of boo hockey. That's a nice way of saying bullshit, euphemized rather appropriately by the workshop as fertilizer. Fertilizer is one of the only two required materials for the creation of the chem jet, which takes up almost no weight in your inventory and is both used in the creation of more complex and useful chems or just as a very valuable trade item all on its own. Mass quantities of jet and its derivatives can empower the procurement of large shipments of hard to keep in stock building materials, all without ever taking a loss on a transaction. So we've already hinted at the fact that often the best way to acquire building resources is to purchase them, but caps tend to be a finite and hard to come by resource. Thankfully, there are often items that you can trade to offset or in many cases completely negate the cost of large quantities of junk. We already mentioned purified water and jet as just two examples, but eventually you're going to have to go questing and dungeon diving, so you might as well keep in mind as you're looting bodies and scrounging in toilets that there are a number of lightweight items that command a hefty premium at the bargain bargaining table. Virtually all chems are close to weightless and tend to be scattered around most raider dens on tables, in chem boxes naturally, and the bodies of deceased raiders, so keep your eyes peeled. Even if you have no need for them yourself, they can be repurposed into useful barter commodities. Grenades and landmines are also fairly low weight, usually weighing around half a pound or whatever a weight unit is supposed to equate to in-game, and most of these can be found on all sorts of defeated enemies and in ammo cans throughout the wasteland. A stack of 10 frag mines only weighs 5 pounds, but it's worth roughly 500 caps depending on charisma and perk selections. As you craft better and better mods for your weapons and armor, the old ones still tend to hang around in your inventory, and while they usually are not that valuable and don't weigh a huge amount, they can slowly snowball on you until a large portion of your capacity is being hogged up by old pistol receivers and assaultron heads. Trade them off for something you'll actually have a use for, or just flat out sell them and never look back. Also, depending on your playstyle, certain types of ammunition can accumulate in your inventory which you may never actually have a practical use for. I've made many a transaction for build materials paying the bill with nothing but plasma cartridges and missiles. If you aren't planning on shooting it, you might as well trade it off to someone who might. A personal guideline I usually stick to in most Bethesda games when I'm out exploring is to only collect items worth 10 currency units or more per weight unit, unless I have a specific need for them. This makes inventory management a lot simpler and means I have to do junk dumps a lot less often. Collecting and purchasing junk items are one way to get your hands on the raw resources necessary to build your settlements, but purchasing large shipments of material is where it's at. Most vendors will carry some sort of shipment of materials that they will ordinarily have lots of on hand. General traders tend to have large quantities of wood, scrap metal, concrete, and other sundries laying around, while medical vendors are going to have your harder to find stuff like glass or antiseptic. Shipments are weightless in your inventory. The real-world explanation is that they're just bills of sale that entitle you to on-site delivery, so just having the paper with you bequeaths said quantity of a given material when you open their workshop. Shipments are normally sold in 25, 50, or 100 unit increments, so you can amass a certain resource much more quickly than by otherwise trying to get it from junk items. The huge benefit shipments provide is that you can pack these receipts around with you with no added weight cost in your inventory and instantly start developing a freshly unlocked build site without having to establish a provisioner line to existing settlements first. Shipments can only be acquired through purchasing, but they are sometimes the best way to manage certain materials, such as concrete. If you're a longtime Grey gamer, you're probably aware that most of my settlements are heavily fortified brutalist as hell concrete strongholds, but the only junk item in game that contains concrete is the bag of cement that only contains 5 units of concrete and weighs a whopping 7 in your inventory. So needless to say, it would be next to impossible to build something like my Starlight Tower build or my Nuka World Castle build if it wasn't for weightless shipments of concrete purchased from junk dealers around the wasteland. If all else fails, you can sometimes get away with crafting the materials you need to build or items that you can trade for build materials. Crafting also has the added benefit of adding XP every time you craft a new item, which can quickly grind away the levels you need to select those must-have perks for intrepid settlement builders. I think I've already mentioned the really big items like adhesive, which isn't really used for settlements but is rather necessary for item mods, but since the better gear you have, the easier it is to go scavenging out in the waste, its importance can't be understated. I've also used the examples of chems and food products as crafted materials that make for good trade goods. There's also cutting fluid crafted at chemistry stations, which contains oil, a difficult to come by resource that often comes with a hefty weight penalty in your inventory when acquired through junk items. Oil is an absolute necessity if you plan on implementing ballistic turrets for defense, generators for power, and a variety of mods and crafted items as well. It's a sad fact of life in the Commonwealth that despite your best efforts, no matter how much crafting you perform, how productive your farms are, how good you are at negotiating the best exchange of frag mines for build materials, you will inevitably have to go out hunting for resources your own damn self. Some locations have higher concentrations of a specific material than others, sometimes only on the first visit as the location doesn't reset once you've cleared it, but others will continuously reset every few in-game days, allowing you to return to a location over and over again to replenish supplies. supplies. This is not an all-exhaustive list by any means, but I'll just detail a few of my personal favorite resource hunting grounds for certain given situations. If you're experiencing a shortage of glass due to the number of windowed structures you're trying to build, then a great place to find it is the Beantown Brewery, which is littered with empty beer bottles. Just about anywhere you go in Nuka World, you'll also find large quantities of empty Nuka-Cola bottles, but they aren't really found in the same concentrations as Beantown. Many of the Wasteland's finer taverns, pubs, and other drinking establishments will also be home to a number of empty alcohol bottles as well, so keep that in mind as you're passing the entrance to the Prost Bar for the umpteenth time. If you're trying to construct a fleet of automated turrets, especially the more advanced ones, you're probably going to run low on circuitry and crystal at some point. The circuitry can be a bit tricky because the best sources of it, like the Assaultron and military-grade circuit boards, can't be found anywhere reliably in high concentrations, but a modest source of circuitry are telephones, which can usually be found in higher concentrations in office buildings. Cambridge Polymer Labs in particular has a lot of phones laying around, but if memory serves, it does not reset, so this location is only good until you've looted them all. For the crystal, microscopes have crystal and can be found at virtually any hospital, school, science lab, or research facility, but microscopes are pretty heavy and it's easy to max out your carrying capacity after picking up just a few of them. But located beneath the Jamaica Plain Town Hall is a vault protected by a large number of laser tripwires, which when disarmed will add some crystal to your inventory. The best thing about these is that the system can be rearmed over and over again, allowing you to infinitely farm the material. If you're upgrading your fleet of power armor, you're probably going to struggle to keep a steady supply of ceramic and aluminum around, and if you're about to try and correct my pronunciation of aluminum, don't, you're an idiot. I'll call it aluminium the day I start speaking the King's English and switch to a British accent. It may be correct on that side of the pond, over here it just makes you a douche. Anyway, the ceramic is usually pretty easy to find, as just about every sitting room, den, lounge, or otherwise place people might take a load off will contain ashtrays made of ceramic. Seriously, what were the lung cancer rates before the war? Also, coffee cups are made of ceramic as well, so just about any place that people drink coffee, pre-war homes, diners, restaurants, offices, they're freaking everywhere. A couple places in particular that will have lots of coffee cups are once again the basement of the Jamaica Plain Town Hall, which was hosting a press conference when the bombs dropped, and Vault 95 that was populated with recovering addicts, so naturally huge amounts of consumption of legal stimulants are to be expected. Vault 95 is also home to a higher than usual concentration of aluminum junk items as well, so you can kill two birds with one stone by visiting here. Unfortunately, it does not reset, so it's only good until it's been looted, then it's really only useful for gunner hunting. The Makra fish packing plant on the far northern coastline has fat stacks of aluminum trays littering the conveyors, so a trip there can add pretty significant quantities to your stores. The Institute is a massive source of aluminum. Virtually every hand tool, doodad, widget, or implement scattered on workbenches, desks, or lab tables is made of it, to the point that it might take several trips back and forth to the surface to completely strip it of its resources, and almost every bedroom has a Wakemaster alarm clock which not only contains aluminum, but also nuclear material. Nuclear material is useful in the construction of more advanced nuclear reactors, producing far more electricity than gas or wind generators, and also for the more advanced optics for weapons. The single best place to get radioactive material is Vault 88, assuming you have the Vault-Tec Workshop DLC. The caverns are loaded with raw uranium which can be scrapped to add vast quantities to the workshop. If you don't have Vault 88 to plunder and exploit, seeking out super mutant dens can let you take advantage of super mutant suiciders who pack a mini nuke with the intention of self-detonating when they get close enough to a target. If you're a good enough aim, you can shoot the mini nuke, setting it off at a distance and leaving a bit of nuclear material behind on the body. Also, using plasma weapons can sometimes leave behind some nuclear material. Glowing variants of creatures can often have some nuclear material on them as well. The glowing sea tends to have higher concentrations of glowing creatures, so if you're desperate, you can scour that area for enemies to harvest from. Oil is one of those resources that's used for just about everything, from frying up your Meyer Alert cakes to lubricating your automated turrets to refueling your conventional generators. You need oil for almost every crafting and settlement management task, but it's not usually found in large quantities in any given spot. It's spread throughout the Commonwealth piecemeal. A couple places with higher than average distributions are Hardware Town, located on the western edge of the Boston Ruins, which has a fair number of paint cans in the back of the warehouse. The Lexington Super Duper Mart has a Mr. Handy fuel canister exchange rack outside the front door, which doesn't give you vast quantities, but it's a respectable amount right next to a fast travel point, so you can get in, grab it, and get out. The Tucker Memorial Bridge has been booby-trapped and turned into a fiery death trap just waiting to happen, and there's some loose fuel canisters that can be had so long as you grab them without setting setting off the trap, otherwise Bethesda's ragdoll physics will launch them into the stratosphere. But even keeping these locations in mind, you'll burn through that oil pretty easily, so crafting cutting fluid will definitely help supplement your supply. Cutting fluid requires two sometimes difficult to come by resources to construct: acid and bone. Bone can be found in the initial visits to all super mutant dens, as the meat bags, sometimes called gore bags in earlier Fallout games, so don't be surprised if I use those terms interchangeably, will often have bones in them, but they don't respawn, so gore bags are really only good for the initial visit. But particularly grisly super mutant dens will often have bones laying around everywhere, which will respawn. Medford Memorial Hospital is one such site. Wildwood Cemetery's crypts will have bones, as will the cages at the bottom of the Dunwich Borer's Pit. There is an unmarked laundromat located on the western edge of Lexington where raiders have been stuffing bodies into the machines, where you can find some bones and a little soap lying around. But I'm not 100% certain if this location is only populated this way after installing the Creation Club anti-material rifle pack, or even if it exists without the CC add-on. If you don't have it and can confirm or deny whether this is the case, that would be immensely helpful to me. For acid, rad scorpion stingers contain some, and there's a very heavy scorpion population to be found in the Glowing Sea as well as in Vault 88. Abraxo Cleaner will provide a good source of acid and can be found in high numbers in Vault 81, though you'll have to integrate yourself into the vault's population before you'll be allowed to take it without it being considered theft. Another great location for Abraxo is an unmarked laundromat located directly between Bunker Hill and the USS Constitution, which, if you've already done that questline, is marked as Weatherby Savings and Loan on your map.
Damn you, Weatherby Savings and Loan!
This laundromat is home to high concentrations of Abraxo as well as several bars of soap which contain oil on their own, so it's a win-win. Rubber can be pretty hard to come by, but is required by almost every Vault-Tec structural object. There is a decent supply in the form of various toys in the gym level of the Boston Mayoral Shelter, and there's an unmarked plumbing supply store in North Cambridge, just east of Watts Consumer Electronics, which I recently explored for the first time while researching my 5 easy ways to fix Automatron video. This store has a large number of toilet plungers, but otherwise there aren't a lot of places that contain rubber. This is where having the Scrapper perk maxed out and using the scrap option for the build limit increase trick from earlier really comes in handy, because heavily modified weapons, especially those with recoil compensating modifications installed, will often produce rubber when scrapped, as well as many other useful materials we've discussed, like crystal, aluminum, steel, wood, plastic, nuclear material, springs, gears, and more. Building settlements is only the first stage of your struggle to rebuild society. You need to also keep your settlers happy in their new homes, otherwise you risk them leaving your settlement network, breaking your provisioner lines, and requiring you to regain their trust somehow. Yay, another Radiant quest! This section will focus on the things you need to know about keeping your settlers happy, and doing so with a bit of style if possible. Happiness is a fairly straightforward concept to grasp. It's a numerical value between 0 and 100 that represents the average happiness of a settlement's population. Each settler contributes to this score, and each settler has their own happiness rating, which will either increase or decrease the settlement's average rating. All settlers arrive at a settlement with a base happiness rating of 50, and it will go up or down depending on whether their basic needs are being met or not. If a settlement already has one settler who has a happiness level of 100 and a new one arrives bringing their rating of 50, the two will average out to a temporary drop to 75. But likewise, if a settlement already has one settler who has a very unhappy 10 and a new settler arrives with their base 50, the settlement's rating will temporarily increase to 30. Robots will never change happiness levels, so sort of a cheat to keep your settlement from ever leaving your network is to ensure there's at least one robot residing there, as it will always keep the average above 0. But this also means that if you do want to maximize the happiness potential of a settlement, you're not able to include robots at that site. You have to send them somewhere else, which is a bit of a bummer since in theory robotic assistance would improve a settlement's happiness rather than prevent it from ever being maxed out. But alas, that's just how the system works. If a certain basic life need is not being met for our settlers, this will cap the happiness rating at a settlement and will not be permitted to grow beyond a certain point until that deficiency is rectified, which sort of makes sense. Having the option to gamble doesn't do much to perk up your spirits when you're hungry, thirsty, and your bed is being rained on. If either water or food are insufficient to support your settlement's population, the happiness rating of the settlement will be capped at 30, which keeps the settlement pretty permanently in danger zone. Now, if a settlement is connected to a provisioner line and the other settlements in your supply chain produce enough excess food and water to support the settler at another, then the caps are lifted, allowing happiness to rise to normal levels. It allows the settlement to essentially import their food and water stores from somewhere else. If a bed is not marked as covered in the game engine, then the settler that uses that bed will have its happiness capped at 60, which can make tracking down the reason why a settlement won't reach 100% a frustrating hassle. Identifying whether a bed is covered or not can be accomplished with console commands for PC or with mods, but if you are a purist who doesn't like using mods, or you're a console player who doesn't have the luxury of console input, yes, the irony is not lost on me, then a good rule of thumb is that player-built structures always count as cover. So as long as you only put beds in new structures that you've built instead of relying on the crumbling pre-war ones that were there when you started, then that bed should be safely considered covered. Insufficient defense is also a problem. Not only will settlements that don't have an adequate defense rating get attacked with higher frequency, resulting in temporary happiness dips, but the happiness level will be capped at 60. Simply meeting the basic needs of a covered bed, basic security, and sufficient food and water rations, you can guarantee that no caps are dragging down your settlement's happiness scores. Happiness is determined through two separate scores, base and bonus. Base happiness is a collection of the 4 basic needs we talked about earlier being provided for a settler. If a settler has a covered bed, that's 20 points. If they have enough food, that's another 20. If they have enough water, that's another 20 points. And if they feel safe in their new home, that's another 20. For a total base happiness score of 80. Assuming there are no robots in a settlement, a happiness score of 80 for a settlement is guaranteed so long as you've met your basic needs. No amount of settler attacks, kidnapping events, or nearby danger dens will be enough to drop the score low enough that they will leave your network. As a general rule, 1 of each resource per settler is all that is required, so if you have a settlement with a population of 20, the total food production and water production must be 20 units, the collective defense rating must be a minimum of 20, but higher is always encouraged in the inevitable event that the settlement will actually be attacked, and there must be 20 covered beds. To provide food, a single food plant provides half of a unit of food, so it takes 2 plants to feed a settler, the lone exception to this rule being mute fruit trees, which produce 1 unit each. A settler assigned to farm duty can tend enough plants to feed 6 settlers, so if you have a settlement of 20 people, a minimum of 4 of those settlers must be assigned to farming, and depending on if you include any mute fruit in your crop selection, up to 40 plants must be tended to provide the minimum food supply for happiness. Water is a lot more straightforward. Water pumps or purifiers produce a set amount of water units. So long as they remain powered, they'll meet their quotas. Just make sure your collective output matches or exceeds your population. The same with defense. Turrets, traps, and guard posts offer a set amount of protection. As mentioned earlier in this guide, a single settler assigned to guard duty will patrol and man up to 3 guard posts, which each produce 2 defense. But depending on the style of turret, you can get between 5 and 15 defense out of a single automated turret, and you aren't pulling a settler away from other possible duties by using them. And I'll once again reiterate the fact that guards are no more effective during attacks than any other settler, while turrets augment your settler's ability to fend off attacks. Also, this is just anecdotal evidence, but I've noticed on a few occasions that my settlement was not reaching base happiness levels until I had manually assigned all of my settlers to a specific bed and assigned all settlers to a task, which I can find no concrete explanations for anywhere on the internet, but I highly recommend doing this, if not for happiness reasons, just to keep your settlers from sleeping in your player home bed and getting the most utility out of them. Assuming that your base happiness level has been reached and there are no caps preventing your happiness rating from rising any higher, the final 20 points of happiness are achieved via happiness bonuses. These are achieved by constructing specific objects in your settlements. Some of these are unmanned general use objects, such as the pommel horse and weight benches, or by manned objects like the barber chair or various storefronts. If an object offers a happiness bonus, it will contain a happy face in its description field in the workshop. The amount of happiness supplied by an object varies and is averaged out among settlers. So as an example, if you have a settlement of 15 people and they have an average base happiness of 80, if you build a store that offers a 15-point bonus to happiness, then that 15 points is spread across the 15 people in the settlement. So that'll average out to an increase from 80 to 81. Now that's just an example I used. You don't have to build 20 stores to get a increase to 100%. If an object that offers a bonus is a manned object, it won't actually provide the bonus unless a settler is assigned to tend it. Different types of stores offer offer differing amounts of happiness bonus, but in general, Tier 3 stores offer the most for each category. Keep in mind that some stores, namely weapons and armor shops, do not improve happiness, and are really just more there to provide trade opportunities to the player, more so than improve the quality of life for the settlers themselves. But headcanon logic would suggest in many cases a weapon and armor dealer would be a welcome addition to a post-apocalyptic town regardless. So now that you understand the basic principles of happiness, then it stands to reason that you can just find what does the most good and just spam the crap out of that option, right? I've seen so many players who've discovered that Tier 3 bars offer the greatest increase to happiness and then just proceed to completely fill out a settlement with nothing but bars and bartenders. Like, ever heard of cirrhosis, alcohol poisoning, Ray's rendition of Wrecking Ball when he's had a bit too many? Okay, who put this crap in my script? Oh, that's right. Okay, sure, spamming bar stalls is a solid gameplay strategy for achieving max happiness, but it's also immersion breaking and painfully transparent what the intended purpose of the objects was when it was built. Happiness comes from a myriad of amenities provided to your settlers: a few cats to control the populations of small pests before they become big pests, junkyard dogs that loyally protect their masters, exercise equipment to keep your settlers fit and healthy, slot machines, and if you have the arcade cabinet CC add-on, some video games to offer a bit of vice and recreation, a Vault-Tec soda fountain to offer a sweet treat to celebrate a job well done, or a full-service market to provide anything that our settlers can't make themselves, easy access to an on-site doctor to heal them when they're wounded or ill. All of these and more contribute to the total overall happiness of our settlements and relate a far more telling picture about the prosperity of our settlers than a collection of people that are completely numb from an overabundance of bars and an underabundance of self-care options. A little patience, critical thinking, prior planning, and attention to detail can mean the difference between making that settlement that is simply utilitarian and gaining that benevolent leader achievement and making one we're actually proud to have built and enjoyable to spend our gameplay time exploring. I know this is not the tip you wanted to hear, but there are a lot of dangers in the wasteland. Sometimes it's a group threatening your settlers if they don't pay up. Sometimes they'll even kidnap your settlers and hold them for ransom. Sometimes the Minutemen hear of their plights and send their highest-ranking member to deal with them, for some reason. And sometimes all hell breaks loose and the settlement gets attacked regardless of our security deterrents. In each of these events, the settlement's happiness will suffer temporarily as a result. If you fail to respond to an attack in a timely manner, mechanical objects can be damaged in the attack due to your inaction, leaving the settlement without power, water, or even defensive turrets. If there's enough supplies in the workshop, the settlers will eventually repair these devices on their own, but if there isn't, well, all those happiness caps we talked about earlier come into effect, and if your settlement already has a happiness cap of 30, and they're upset because the Minutemen didn't come to their aid when they were attacked, and one of their neighbors just got kidnapped by super mutants, well, goodbye Soul Survivor, you're no longer welcome here. As irritating as it is to have to drop everything you're doing to respond to these events, it's the only way to ensure long-term happiness and loyalty of your settlements. Well, I hope you found this collection of tips, tricks, hacks, and misused features to be helpful, but I acknowledge that this is by no means a complete list of everything that you can do to build better, more impressive, happier settlements as quickly and efficiently as possible. If one of your favorite strategies wasn't included, I would love to hear it, and I would be interested in knowing whether you were surprised by any of these and whether you intend to put any of these into practice in your own settlements. Until next time, stay safe, and I hope to see you here next time on Gray Gaming.